Kristen, you were at that briefing. This has been something, you were on the campaign trail nonstop with Donald Trump during 2024. It's something he talked about, crime in cities constantly, including and especially this one in Washington, D.C. But militarizing United States cities, starting with the District of Columbia, frankly, because it's just easier because of the home rule law. What should we be thinking about, and what are you hearing from your sources in that building behind you?
Yeah, I mean, I think that we should look at this as the larger picture, as you're mentioning. I mean, he even talked about New York, Chicago, trying this out in D.C., and then he might go to other large cities, talking about crime in those cities. As you mentioned, this is something he talked about a lot on the campaign trail in terms of using federal law enforcement in cities. But we also want to mention that at various times he's walked back this idea of federalizing the law enforcement, putting National Guard into cities. And in fact, I've spoken to a number of people in the DC government who said that they were surprised by this announcement, particularly given that the relationship seemed to be on okay terms between Mayor Muriel Bowser and President Trump. She has been in the Oval Office with him. She has had meetings with him. Their teams are almost in constant touch, although it does seem as though this was something that might have blindsided them. Clearly here he is ramping up the rhetoric around this. And two of the things that he said, in addition to obviously saying that the Metropolitan Police Department is going to be under federal law and deploying the National Guard, he said he might deploy active duty military to address crime. He also said that more service members might be going in as guardsmen. All of this to amplify the federal response. And I will tell you, Dana, one kind of strange part of all of this is that when we sat down in the briefing, they gave us a packet of information to show us some of the arrests that were made over the weekend as this starting to ramp up or increase in federal law enforcement took place. And they were fairly low-level criminals. It was somebody with possession or a DUI at one point. And there were only 5 of them, I believe, listed in this packet. So it's unclear, he's talking about this major escalation in violent crime, but that is not quite clear from the packet of information that he gave us here. And of course, I know you're going to have someone fact check the actual numbers coming out of DC and the Department of Justice. But he has clearly had some sort of an escalation when it comes to this just over the last 3 days. And I was told it was all he talked about all day Saturday were the outrageous crime numbers and how they were going to bring in more federal law enforcement.
All right, Kristen, thank you so much for that. And we are going to now do a deep dive into the fact check, claiming that Washington, D.C. is getting worse. And I want to bring in the one and only Daniel Dale. Daniel.
There was a lot of deception from the president there. So here's a reality check. There is no doubt that D.C. has for decades been a high crime city. It is among the U.S. cities with the highest homicide rates, though there are a bunch of other big cities that are worse. And D.C. did indeed have a big crime spike in 2023, which is the year the president kept citing. But contrary to what the president said today, even in 2023, D.C. did not have an all-time high in murder. It was way worse during the crack crisis of the 80s and early 90s. And more pressingly, Dana, the president was just flat wrong when he said it's getting worse now, not getting better. Crime in D.C., including murder, has fallen sharply since that 2023 spike. It fell in 2024. It's fallen further in 2025. So let's look at some of this data. In 2023, D.C. had its most murders in more than 2 decades, 274. Of course, that's terrible. But it then plunged to 187 murders last year, and it's been falling again so far this year. Through July, according to figures compiled by crime data expert Jeff Asher, D.C. had 34% fewer murders than it did through the same period in that year, 2023. Now, how about violent crime more broadly? Well, that's also down sharply in the last year and a half. In fact, per Jeff Asher, DC's officially reported violent crime rate in 2024 was the second lowest since 1966, so lower than every year of Trump's first administration. It's about a third of what it was in those bad old days, the early 1990s. And you heard from the president and his team about carjackings. Well, indeed a problem in DC, but what do the numbers say? Again, a big spike in 2023, down since. Asher noted the 16 carjackings reported in July were the fewest reported in any month in more than 5 years in DC, down more than 87% from the same month in 2023. So look, we know crime is an issue in DC. We've lived there. We know that every violent crime is a shame, a tragedy, of course, not excusing any of them. But this isn't an ongoing crime spike like President Trump suggested. And he said it's rising even in the text of the executive order. I went through it. The first section says crime is rising in the Capitol. That is just not true.
Daniel, thank you so much. I really appreciate you bringing all of that to us. Really important fact checks. And back here at the table, look, I'm not here to say that, as Daniel just showed with the actual facts and data, that crime is not an issue in this city or other cities across the country. The question is about scope and about the context in which crime is happening now versus what we've seen in the past, versus also the difference between now and the past, which is that you have a president who feels emboldened to use the National Guard and perhaps more active duty military on the streets of this country.
Yeah. And I think the question, what you brought up, David, is such an important one. Why is this happening now? I mean, this is a remarkable move by the president to federalize the DC police, to bring in the National Guard, to say that he would potentially bringing in active duty military. And I do think, look, this is clearly an issue that the president has bothered him for some time. Throughout this term in office, just the last couple of months, he hates driving through DC. When I was talking to White House officials, they say because whenever he takes his motorcade and he sees a homeless tent or something like that, it infuriates him further. And yes, he is someone who, by and large, wants to paint himself as a law and order president. He also repeatedly this year has gone farther than in his first term in testing the boundaries of his executive authority. And so we're kind of seeing that all come together. The question is why now? And it's one we don't really have an answer for. And to see him standing up there and taking questions for the better part over an hour really on this, it is remarkable, but it's still unclear why he's choosing this moment to move forward with this.
I would say, though, that although it is a dramatic step, this is tethered to how he has always felt about American cities. He has always felt that American cities, especially those with large Black populations like Washington, D.C., are crime-ridden and run by incompetent leadership, as he repeated today. But this comes with a tremendous amount of risk. Historically, when we have seen police be federalized, it has led in this country in some instances to extreme acts of violence. And so whatever happens in the days ahead, President Trump will ultimately have to own that. And then I'll say this. Mayor Bowser, she really capitulated to President Trump. What did that ultimately get her? I think the Democrats more broadly are trying to figure out how to navigate Trump, how to work around him or with him in this moment. And it seemed like ultimately this display from him today was a spit in her face.
And listen, I mean, I mentioned this at the beginning, but we should give our viewers a little bit more information about why it is so easy for him to deal with DC versus other cities, because DC is not part of a state. Everybody knows that. And here's what the Home Rule Act of 1973 does. It allows presidents to take control of DC police for 48 hours if he determines that special conditions of an emergency nature exist. 48-hour period can be extended if he notifies relevant congressional committees, and then taking control for more than 30 days must be passed into law.
Yeah, I mean, there's a opportunistic aspect to this that, as we said, he sees it every day, but the law allows him to do this. Now, it's not the first place he did this. He sent the federal troops into Los Angeles to crack down on protesters who are upset over the immigration raids, right? Yeah. So this is not the first time we're seeing this. And to Elena's point, in the second term, he is not just thinking about it and there's no one there to talk him down, no one there to say, well, we really should think long and hard about doing this. There are a lot of people who are saying, that sounds like a great idea, and they'll stand up there at the press conference with him and they'll pat him on the back and say, thanks to you, this is a great idea, and we're going to get it under control. I mean, you saw the people who are up there, Judge Jeanine, everybody's on the same page about this. There's nobody trying to restrain any of these impulses in the second term, and he's really going for it in a number of different ways. I think in terms of why now, we don't have concrete information, but I think two things that are obvious. One, he mentioned it himself, the attack on the Doge staffer recent days, and the the fact that there was a carjacking and this person who has some notoriety, at least in D.C. or within the administration, was attacked. He cited that as sort of a pretext for doing this broader, more dramatic thing. And there was also a question at the end about the Epstein case. And the press conference, which went on for a long time, it ended pretty quickly after that subject was brought up. So is this another attempt to change the subject? We don't know, but that hypothesis certainly has to be thought about as we consider why now.